Good morning, everyone. And I am very grateful to the Marks Paneth team for inviting me here today. And I've worked with them in the past on a number of issues and sought their counsel and advice. It's very nice when you're a regulator to have people you can go to that you can trust and have confidence that they know the field and they will give you the straight story. So I'm very grateful for that, and I appreciate being invited here today. I guess I should start off before we get here. One of the challenges for the nonprofit community is the idea of disruption. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But in early May of 2018, it was about 6 o'clock. I was just, figured to be going home about a half an hour, and I got an urgent call from upstairs in the Attorney General's office where we had just moved from my boss saying, all the bureau chiefs need to come up here right away. And I walked in the room, and I was told that there's a story coming out in the New York Times at 7 o'clock tonight. And he said, I haven't seen it yet, but I want you to know everything. What I'm told is that everything was consensual. All right. If you live in New York, you know that the next thing that happened was the Attorney General had resigned by 9 p.m. All right. And I think as we look at what happens in organizations, we have these great plans. We have, I had a 5-year plan about where we're going to go with this organization. And now I've had the Barbara Underwood, who took over as Attorney General, is great. And I'm sure the next Attorney General will be wonderful too. But it's the kind of thing where it reminds you that no matter how carefully you plan, reality tends to get in the way. So I'm sure many people in the room have had the same kind of experience, but it's you think in government, we've been here since 1789, but things do happen. When we talk about New York charitable nonprofits, one of the interesting aspects is there are so many different segments to this industry. And I guess I say industry, this area. And very often what we find is that the segments don't talk to each other. So I'm going to be talking about some of these today, but it's important to recognize we have a more diverse, both in terms of activity and in terms of people, nonprofit sector than any place else in the country. And so much of what makes New York great is based on nonprofit organizations. So in the work that I do with the Attorney General's office, one of the things we try to do is outreach like this. And part of that is to the major colleges and universities around the state. There are so many places here that run nonprofit training programs at the master's level and the undergraduate level. So so I've been to NYU, Columbia, Fordham, Yeshiva, Syracuse, a variety of other schools, and they invite me in for one class, sort of like you're inviting me in here today. But what you learn is when you go into these classes is that it's not just people from New York, it's not just people from the Northeast, not just people from the US. People come to New York City and New York State to learn about how to run a nonprofit and how to start a nonprofit. And when I was in government school back many years ago, we all wanted to work in government. We all wanted to be like the chief of staff to somebody and change the world there. When I go and talk to these students today, they don't want to work for government, which is not so good for us. But it's very good for you because they all want to work for nonprofits, even the people who go to government school. So what does that tell us? The second aspect of New York is international innovation. So you look and you see how many international charities are based here. And they take these ideas and they take these students and they take their systems and take them around the world. So you look at the NGOs that are doing good everywhere, so many of them are based here. Private donors and foundations, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the amount of money that is given out here, and you hear all about Silicon Valley because they're sort of household names. A lot of the money in New York State is in the financial industry, which people here may know, but is not generally well known. But the number of foundations, I think, exceeds any other state, and there are a lot of, doing good deeds without announcing their presence that exist. The next piece is the city, state, and federal assistance and grants. And I use Senator Gillibrand's website because it's very good at sort of laying out what kind of grant programs are out there and how they work at the city, state, and federal level. So how do we get here? How did New York become the world capital of nonprofits? And interestingly, if you look at Philadelphia and Boston, they're both founded as theocracies. Basically, they were religious organizations posing as governments. We never had that problem here, right? New York has been a business since the day it started with the Dutch. And When the British acquired them in 1685, the second time, they said, well, we have an established church, so we're going to steal them out. I'm sorry, we're going to take the property which the Dutch have, and we're going to give it to Trinity Church, which is now the largest real estate company in New York, disguised as a religion. I'm sorry, that's not fair. They're religion too, but you go back and you look at the deeds, and they come back from 1685, and basically it's a grant from the king. Other cities had private hospitals. New York State founded the first public hospital at Bellevue, and didn't have a private hospital since 1791. And the issue is, how do we go from that, the government has the responsibility, to this idea that people had to get together themselves and organize? And again, in Philadelphia and Boston, we had this religious support for it. It didn't exist here. And I think the big change, and I think of this in comparison to what's going on today, was the Underground Railroad and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And you're saying, you're going to give me a history lesson in my 50 minutes on nonprofits. But here's the reality. Prior to 1850, if you were an enslaved person and you got across the border into Pennsylvania, except for occasional bandit slave catchers, you were free. All right. In 1850, a party which was run by a Buffalonian decided that they would make a compromise with the South, and they would change the laws, and they would change the laws such that people who were enslaved and escaped to the northern states, every government official had the responsibility to capture them and to return them to their owners in the South. And the enslaved people did not have a right to a jury trial. They weren't allowed to testify on their own behalf, and a lot of the rights which had previously existed, such as they were, disappeared. And what you find is that people who up to then had relied upon the government to do what needed to be done got together and said, we can't trust the government anymore to do these things, so we need to organize on our own. So if you look at how New Yorkers organized in response to the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, what you see, I think, is a parallel to some of the things we're seeing now in terms of the relationship between the federal government and I'll call it the private nonprofit sector. Two examples, in opposing the government. One was in Syracuse, where they rescued an enslaved person who was captured by the marshal, and also in Troy, it was basically a riot. Right? I'm not recommending riots as a social activity, but they basically seized the people back from the federal officials who had seized them. The next big step in nonprofits in New York was New York lawyers. And you're not going to go to a lot of conferences where they say, aren't lawyers great? And I guess I'm not going to say that today, but here's what happened. The Rockefellers were not beloved. This may surprise you all, because we think of the foundation now and some other people. They were, to put it mildly, not beloved. If you think of BP and multiply it by 4 or 5, a Rockefeller descendant, by the way, you get a sense of how people felt about the Rockefellers. So Mr. Rockefeller really didn't want his legacy to be, we all hate you and we hope you die. And so, but he also he wanted to control the Rockefeller Foundation in perpetuity through his family. And he looked for a way to do it. And New York lawyers, being New York lawyers, said, this is what you want, we're going to find a way to get there. And they first went to Congress and said, can you give us a charter for a federal foundation? Because as New York law exists now, you can't do that. And because it was Rockefeller and because they were suing Standard Oil, even the president refused to meet with them and said, we're not going to do it. And so what they did was they went to the New York State Legislature, which then is now was the best well, okay. Step away from that. They got a special act passed, all right? And typically in those days, legislatures were very jealous of corporations. You had to have a very specific purpose. We're going to run the streetcars. We're going to run the ferries. We're going to do something. When charities, we're going to take care of the poor in New York City for a certain purpose. Rockefeller, I don't want to do that. I want to do whatever I want to do that is charitable. So they said, okay, what's the purpose of this charity, right? Applying the income principle to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. Nice narrow definition of a charitable purpose, and basically they can do anything they want within the charitable realm. But once you teach lawyers how to do something once, they take that model and they tell other people, look, if the Rockefellers and the Carnegies are doing it, you should do it too with your money, and you should do it here. So we were the original place for people to set these things up. If you think, I mean, Carnegie and Rockefeller are both New Yorkers eventually, but the idea, people came from all over the country to set up their foundations and their charities and say, New York will give us the ability to do that and also the protection, all right? If you go to Australia or Canada or other places in some states, Pennsylvania comes to mind, if you donate, make a gift to a charity, once you pass away, who protects your intent? And the answer is, in New York, the state, the Charities Bureau of the state. In many jurisdictions, in Australia, if you say, I'm going to give you $100 million, but here's what I want you to do with it. If you say, here's what I want you to do with it, you lose your tax deduction, all right? Because the idea is we should trust the charities. You probably like that idea, but if you look at the giving tech activity, this has been such an incentive for people because they have confidence about what's going to happen. All right, so I'm going to walk through. So that's your history lesson in 8 minutes. But we are different. We are different in New York. We have the biggest nonprofit sector, and in large part because of the commitment and generosity of New Yorkers, but also because we have the systems and processes in place. And I'll say our New York nonprofit statutes are part of that process. All right. So what do we do here at the Charities Bureau, right? Registration, reporting, and disclosure. We're going to talk about that a little bit. We help people get state and city grants. We protect charities, assets, endowments. We try to protect their independence. And that's an increasing challenge because as legislators look around for funding, the temptation to go after endowments and funds is great. And we try to protect their reputation. And finally, we hold professionals who work with charities accountable. So I'm going to talk about a very boring issue, but I think an important one, and that is registration, all right? So one way we are able to tell what's going on in the charitable sector in New York is by the registration activity. So if you conduct charitable activities, you hold assets, you solicit money, or you're a professional fundraiser, you have to register with us. And every year, 4,000 new charities register in New York. So we have about 85,000 total, 4,000 new registrants. Remember all those people who go to the Wagner School or Columbia or NYU, graduate school in fundraising, that want to start their own charities? A lot of them do it, all right? And like any new business, some succeed and some fail, but 4,000 a year. So in your materials, you will see, as of November 1st, we're going to require that anyone who wants to start a new charity register with us electronically. Shocking thought. And we've had some pushback. I mean, people say, I do this on my kitchen table, I don't have a computer. But when I worked at HRA, 70% of our recipients of our clients who got food stamps had the internet on their phones. All right, so my thought is if the people who are the poorest in our society can figure this out and do it, we think the charities can do it too. And in the old days, it would take somebody 70 to 80 days to register because they would send in their documents and their form. And if you ever filled out a form on paper, you get tired after the first 2 pages and you start to put stuff in that you're not 100% sure is correct, but you just want to get through it. The way the registration works, it's not quite Amazon, but it's pretty close. The idea is when you get there, we'll tell you what to bring, we'll tell you what to put down, we'll tell you when you're done, and within 2 to 5 days, you will get an approval from New York State that you're registered. So we think that's a huge advantage on the front end for new charities. It's also good for our staff who don't go through things 4 and 5 times, send them back and say, here's a piece of paper you need to give us. And the idea is all electronic. And this lists out what you need, The second piece of our transparency with the public is the annual filing requirements, all right? And what you'll see is we have a CHAR 500, right, which is a form on our website, and we have a requirement that you give us your IRS 990. And when I arrived, I felt like I was visiting, how shall I phrase this? There are opportunities for improvement, let me put it that way. We would get 40 pages of documents on paper in an envelope. On November 15th, there would be 20 wagons of these things that would come up from the mailroom, and people would sit at the Xerox machine and copy each page. All right, so it would go into our computer system because it was electronic, but it was basically an electronic filing cabinet. And we think that although the system worked, it was pretty clunky. And so I said, we need to change this. And then I learned about computer IT systems in the state government, and also how difficult it is. You know, when you go on these seamless websites, you say, wow, that's great, it's very efficient. The work required to get it to that point is significant. And getting lawyers to think about systems and processes, anybody who's done that knows it's a challenge. But so we have bids that came back on the 2nd of October to make the entire annual filing process electronic. And my expectation is we'll have that up and running in about 13 months. And it will make life easier for you. It'll make life easier for the audit and accounting firms that work with you. It'll make life easier for the registration firms as well. Okay. Next thing is, we do state agencies and city agencies, many of them don't maintain their own review systems, but even if they do, they rely upon us to tell them that your organization is in good standing. All right. So my assistant Eileen gets calls on the last day when the documents have to be put in, saying, they tell me I'm not registered. Well, you could have told yourself you're not registered, but put that aside. Or I didn't make my annual filing. Can you just tell them that I did? Right. And we explain the Attorney General's job is to enforce the law, not to violate it. But the key here is they reach out to us to say, are they current? And if you're not, it's unlikely that you'll get funding from the city or the state. And we also work with the new State Grants Gateway, because if you're going to do procurement, you'll have those documents on file. You don't have to file them 20 times. So now I want to talk, so that's registration. And if you have people in your organization who are working either on registering new charitable entities or doing the annual filing, it's worthwhile to just make sure that that's happening on a timely basis. We will get about 35,000 pieces of mail between November 1st and November 15th for people whose fiscal year ends in December. And what you will also get on occasion in that process. So every one of those documents, and I think we're different from any other state this way, every one of those documents that is filed with us is reviewed by a person. All right. Once our people take it and Xerox it, put it in the computer system, there's an evaluator who looks at it, and you may get a letter saying the following things are missing from this activity. Now, and so we look to you to set, and so what's interesting to me is one of the primary contacts the Charities Bureau has with the charity sector is, we got your filing, thank you very much, but the following items are missing. So please be responsive to that. Again, we try to one of the things we want to rely upon is data to say how compliant is this organization, how good are its processes and systems. Part of that is the audit, part of that is the 990 itself, but part of that is if it says you have to submit 3 things and you get a letter saying you didn't submit 2, the fact that you're non-responsive is a measure of our concern about the organization. So this year, 2017-18, we brought a series of we think are significant cases. And again, our focus is looking to protecting charitable assets, protecting charitable resources, making sure that organizations are focused on doing their good work and not enriching people inappropriately. So one of the cases that, you'll find all these things on our website, but I want to talk about them briefly. The Shulman complaint. So Isaac Shulman was the head of the New York Legal Assistance Guild. And he had been there for a long time. He was very effective. And so at one point, he told the board, this is all in the complaint we filed, he told the board, we're too successful in our fundraising. Now, I'm sure you want to have this problem too, but we need to take some money off the balance sheet and put it somewhere else so that when our donors look at our 990, they won't see that we have so much money, because then they won't give us money. Don't try this at home, and again, I look around the room and I realize there are very few organizations with this problem, but it's a lawyer group. So, and so what he said was, I want to take this money, we should take this money and we should put it in a donor-advised fund. And I'd have just a fund for us to work with. All right, so what he did was to take the money, several $1 million, and put it in the donor-advised fund. Now, what do we know about donor-advised funds? Once you put the money in a donor-advised fund, you don't control it anymore. All right? It is controlled, in theory, by the board of the donor-advised fund. So it's no longer your asset. So as a legal matter, he was right? It's not going to show up on our balance sheet. Now, don't try this with Mark Paneth, by the way, because it won't fly. But with the accountants they had at the time, who I think were retired and living in Florida, they weren't paying a lot of attention. And so the fact that several $1 million moved off the balance sheet without any sign of where it went did not bother them. So once he did that, he realized he started moving the funds from the donor advised fund of NILAG, the donor advised fund of Schulman. All right, and started moving the money to a variety of other organizations with Hugel, some of which he said owed him money, some of which he said were good organizations, and he felt the assets were appropriate. In the end, several $1 million moved from NILAG to these entities. All right, and we allege that some came back to him. Where was the board during all this? All right, so at some point they got a new accountant, right, new auditor. And the new auditor didn't know about this money because, of course, there was no record in the organization that it was there. But they said, your fiscal controls really could use some work. So they did a management letter saying there's insufficient segregation of duties and you don't have a controller in place. And they sent that letter to the board. The chair of the audit committee didn't show up for any audit meeting, so it really was not something that he spent a lot of time on. And the second year, they got the same letter. Okay, so one of the things about management letters, if you get a management letter, that to me is good. It says, number one, that your auditor is paying attention and doing a good job. And two, you've gotten information that you as an audit committee or as a board can make decisions about. The same letter twice is not a good thing. All right, that tells us no one is paying attention and responding. So at the end of the day, Mr. Schulman paid back all the money. He's now out of the business of being a fiduciary for charities for quite a while. The organization entered an agreement with us to sort of straighten up their processes. The donor advised fund entered an agreement with us because their view was they were taken advantage of. But here's the thing: when you look at donor advised funds, if you wanted to launder money in this country, apart from buying real estate in New York City, the best way to launder it is donor advised funds. This is not legal advice, by the way, but because on the front end, the money comes in the door, right? It can come from anywhere. And if you're a bank, you have to know your customer and you have to report to the federal government on a regular basis. Donor advised funds don't have to report to anybody. So we're going to do a webinar in November on donor advised funds and best practices, because once we saw this, we started to look around, and there are ones who do a very good job on the front end, that is, where did the money come from? In the middle on who are the donor advisors and what's their authority? And at the end on, is the donor getting a benefit personally from his advice to the donor advised fund? So if you're working with them, this is where you're in a donor advised fund. There are various views about donor advised funds, but there are best practices in that business. Next one, McInerney Brady. So in my mind, remember, the only professional that the law in New York requires you to hire is an auditor, right? Outside of your organization, independent auditor. And that's because independent auditors have a professional responsibility to make sure the financial records accurately reflect, according to the ICPA standards, what's going on in the organization. So it will not surprise you that good clients find good auditors, and bad clients find auditors who are much more accommodating. So Mr. Brady was the most accommodating auditor they could find. And what the situation with him, so we have these fundraisers, and they'll set up a constellation of feel-good charities. So one is breast cancer, one is animals, one is veterans, one is police and fire. And the way the system works is the fundraiser gets 90% of the funds that are raised. And so they run a boiler room or a direct mail service, and they send out these letters with pictures of children with no hair or pets or whatever. And then they collect the money. They give 10% or less to the charity, and they keep 90% for themselves. And they basically control the charities. There's a board that isn't very effective. And so Mr. Brady was called in, arranged through this particular fundraiser, to do the audit for an organization that did breast cancer work, in theory. During the entire time he did the audit, he never talked to, and his staff never talked to, anybody at the charity. The fundraiser was his sole conduit to find out what's going on in the organization. All right. I think at the end of the term, they did sign the management representations, but otherwise no contact. And it was interesting to me, he had professionals working for him, and if you've been a junior professional in a firm, you know it's sometimes a little intimidating. Go to the boss and say, we're doing things we ought not to be doing under the standards I was taught. What's the story here? So not just one, but two of his staff came to him and said, how can we do an audit without ever talking to anybody in the organization? I mean, our professional standards don't allow that to happen. And besides which, how should we test the information the fundraiser is giving us? And he said, I don't want to hear about it. We've worked with these people for years. This is what we're going to do. So eventually they both left. But because, unlike lawyers, auditors make very careful work papers and they're available to us, they made records in the work papers saying this is what they did. So we filed a complaint against McInerney Brady, and we got a judgment against them for relatively substantial amount, all the fees they'd gotten paid, and also we got a commitment that Mr. Brady will not be doing nonprofit audits again. Next piece is the Trump Foundation complaint. And again, in each of these things, we're talking about what is the significance of the governance requirements we have and the professional support requirements we have, and what do we do when people violate them? So Schulman, right, very basic audit requirements that he tried to evade, and prudent management of institutional funds, things he tried to evade, and the board was not paying attention. Brady was an auditor, his audit was required by law, and he wasn't doing his job. The Trump Foundation, so we have some basic requirements in New York, like if you're on the board, you actually have to go to the meetings on occasion. Not every time, but on occasion. And you actually have to pay attention to what's going on in the organization. Well, Mr. Trump had his children on the board, not an unusual foundation situation. They never went to a meeting. They had no idea what was going on. He basically used the foundation as an adjunct to his business. And the way it worked was if a check was going to a for-profit organization, that came out of the Trump organization. If a check was going to a nonprofit for whatever reason, the check came out of the Trump Foundation. All right, so the variety of things in which money was spent had nothing to do with charity, but the money went there. The other part of this that was concerning to us was one of the basic rules, the Johnson Amendment, says you can't operate a charity in support of a political campaign. So the night before, couple nights before the Iowa primaries, he held a fundraiser, and all the banners said Trump Foundation and Make America Great Again. And essentially what he did was to use that as a promotional device for his campaign. So you can't do that. So our complaint says we want you to dissolve this foundation and to impose a restriction on both the children and Mr. Trump in taking on future nonprofit fiduciary positions. And we got calls after that. I mean, when I think of our statute, it's sort of like a cookbook. Here's what you have to do in order to run a nonprofit. And the reason we have those rules is twofold. Number one, it is a guidebook to say, here's what you do as a nonprofit fiduciary, whether you're an officer, director, or an employee, and here are the ways you make records of it. All right, so that like anything else, we know what's going on and the assets and resources are being used appropriately. The second reason we have the statutes and the Revitalization Act is, if you have a disagreement with another person on the board, it's one thing to say, you're acting in your own self-interest and that's bad and you shouldn't do it. So it's bad is not a conversation starter. Much easier to say, the statute says, if we're going to have a related party transaction, we have to go through these 4 steps and make a record of it. That's not personal. That's just what the law requires. Now, you can always move to Delaware, right, which it gets a quarter of its money from corporate franchise fees. And if you go on their state website, it says, we're business friendly, and we try to give people the maximum opportunity to do whatever they want as management. I don't think that's the way to run a country, but that's why we have 50 states. Catholic Church sex abuse allegations and investigations. So the grand jury report came out in Pennsylvania, 300 priests, over 1,000 victims with credible allegations. And so the issue here for us in New York is that kind of full-scale investigation had never been done here. There was one in Long Island and one in Westchester, but it never been done across the board. And so, as we'll see a bit later, one of the real concerns we have is with the rise of the Me Too movement, it's amazing how much is suddenly coming to light. And people who before were ashamed and embarrassed and uncomfortable coming forward or felt they wouldn't be listened to now do. So there's a very delicate balance for us. You know, the church, in fact, has done some things in the last 20 years to address these issues, but also their victims have been living in silence for 20 years. So we are conducting an investigation of that situation. Fraudulent fundraising operation bottom feeder, I talked about the fundraisers with the 90%. Supreme Court says 90% is legal. You just have to show they're defrauding donors in order to make a case, or they're violating the state statutes and organizations. That's what we're doing. And embezzlement project, we'll see in a little bit how that works. So if you think about embezzlements for a second, everybody gets embezzled from, right? The federal government gets embezzled from, the state government gets embezzled from, guys who run parking lots get embezzled from, law firms get embezzled from, the American Red Cross gets embezzled from, the American Bar Association gets embezzled from. It happens. So a good accountant, a good auditor will tell you, here are the internal controls you can set up, but the mind of the human is infinitely ingenious. And some of them sit up. You know, you go home at night at 6:30 or 7 o'clock and spend time with your family. They're lying up, staring at the ceiling, thinking of new ways to steal. All right. My wife works for DOCS, and people who are incarcerated have the same kind of thing about what they're going to do to get back at the organization. They think about it all the time. So it's going to happen. And the embarrassment factor is huge, right? People feel when bad things happen in the organization, you feel somehow responsible. With Attorney General Schneiderman, we said, how do we miss this? How do we not know this was going on? Right? We didn't. So that's reality. The embezzlements are going to happen. And this Boston Globe story, I'd suggest you take a look at it because it has a list. They published a list in 2018 of every organization in every state that had reported embezzlement on their IRS 990. And there are 119 from New York, right? And remember, that form, it either has to be $50,000 or I think 5% of your assets that are stolen. So there's a lot more embezzlement out there. And what we find over and over is that people don't want to deal with it. And it's the same thought process as sexual harassment. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to tell the public. I don't want to tell the controller. He's a good guy, made some mistakes. Let's let him resign quietly. And lawyers will tell you to do this. In my mind, a very bad idea, all right? But if you're a lawyer thinking about this case, the temptation is to say, just let him go. You can't leave this to the lawyers. You have to think about what the impact's going to be in your organization. So I wanted to show you a few embezzlers. Michael Klein is my favorite, and in large part because he rescued a cat from a tree in Putnam County, and this is his firefighter rescue the cat outfit. And the Putnam Daily Voice photographer just happened to be in the neighborhood when he came down from the tree with a cat. So, gotta like the guy, right? Except he was the treasurer of the Mahopac Volunteer Fire Company. And fire companies and sports leagues for us, you know, every week there's another allegation. But he embezzled for 13 years, which is a hell of a job, especially since he had to file with the IRS 990, reporting what they did. He wrote 275 checks for $5.7 million to his own two businesses, right? So a little related party problem there in addition to an embezzlement problem. And with that money, he bought a 55-foot yacht, jewelry, a home in Florida, and an antique fire truck. I guess to see the fire truck on the IRS 990, that wouldn't be unreasonable. The other stuff, not really. So we go back, and one of the interesting things in New York is we have jurisdiction over a lot of entities that don't file with us. So volunteer fire companies, ambulance companies who only raise money in theory from government, their own members, do not have to file with us. And private colleges don't have to file with us. But it doesn't mean we don't have jurisdiction over bad acts. So what he did was, you know, if you talk to firefighters, they say, I trust this man with my life. How can I not trust him with the money? And the answer is they're two very different things, all right? Go into a burning building to save people. It's very clear what your responsibility is. Embezzling over time, people sort of accustom themselves to it. So who signed the IRS 990? Mike Klein, the thief. The preparer, I won't say their name except to say they did put their name on the 990. And you know the standard questions, governance questions. Did you become aware of a significant diversion of his assets during the year? And Michael Klein said no, because he already knew. Did you document meetings? And the answer is no. Do you have a conflict of interest policy? The answer is no. Only 2 officers, no directors. Here's the thing. When he filed these documents, it was almost impossible to sort IRS 990s because the IRS used the same system we did for the public, which was PDF. It's an electronic file cabinet. In the last 2 years, the IRS has made the data available on Amazon, and a variety of private contractors now give us the ability to analyze data across charities, including the answers to these questions. Okay, so one of the things we're going to do, again, next year we're changing attorneys general, but one of the things we want to look at next year in terms of data is, if people answer these questions, no, I have no meetings, no, I have no conflict of interest policy, no, we only have 2 officers, that's a message that there's a concern here that we need to take a look at. And we want to do a risk assessment and a risk sorting of organizations to say we need to look at this more closely. These are my 2 favorite things on the Schedule O. I'm a 990 nerd, so this is, it says, what review will be conducted of the IRS 990 by the board? He was honest. No review was or will be conducted. How will the document be made available to the public? No documents available to the public, all right? Again, this is the kind of free text that we would go look for now that the data is becoming available. So it turns out that he's not the only thief working in a fire department. So Briarcliff Manor fire chief steals $120,000. The Croton fire treasurer steals $313,000. The Patterson fire department treasurer steals $1.1 million. All right. So if you live in a community which is using a volunteer fire company, again, most of these people are incredibly earnest and sincere, and it's a social as well as a good deeds, and it's the kind of community building we want to have. But somebody should ask the question, who's minding the funds? And that should be their auditor. And it should be the members. So we don't want to just pick on accountants. Mr. Ed Kine was an attorney, and he worked with an accountant to root $3 million from a client's charitable trust through sham nonprofits to buy himself a $3.5 million mansion in Long Island. Don't do this at home. And so that he took a guilty plea this year in September. And we find charitable trusts. Part of our job is to police them. Finding out what's going on with them is often a huge challenge. Other embezzlers from New York recently, Derek Brooms, Harlem Congregation for Community Improvement, embezzled $200,000. He was sentenced in May. Dennis Black, this is one of my favorite academic frauds. There was a board that consisted of students and administrators, and he would pick students he knew wouldn't show up, right? So there was no oversight from them. He was the overseer, and he just wrote checks from the organization. And Dr. David Smith from SUNY Upstate, he took $150,000 from the New York SUNY Research Foundation. So this is an equal opportunity set of crimes, and the issue is primarily opportunity, right, and internal controls. Okay, so the next piece we have in thinking about independence, which is our job, is what are we doing? Now, if you look at Pennsylvania, for example, the Barnes Foundation is an art museum there, and Mr. Barnes was a character beyond belief, but he was an art collector too, and he wrote a will saying, I'm leaving all my money to this building, to this organization, to display my incredible collection in the way that I've said it, and I want a school to be there that'll teach the kind of art that I thought should be taught. And the state of Pennsylvania decided that was not appropriate. They could make a lot more money could be made, and there was a tourist attraction if they moved the entire collection to Center City, Philadelphia, from the suburb it was in. And they went to court and said, our interest, the state's interest, and the public interest is that whatever Mr. Barnes' will said, we want to move the stuff to another building and build a new museum. And the court said yes. And then they went to court again because the Hershey Foundation said, we have all our money in Hershey stock. We really should diversify our portfolio, right? Which in New York is the law. You're not supposed to keep your money in one place. And the court in Pennsylvania said, well, it's too important to the people of central Pennsylvania that Hershey continue as a company. So you can't diversify your shareholder interest. You can't sell off a portion of the stock or sell off an interest in the company. Very, very different from what's done in New York. Charitable assets only for charitable purposes. Again, the Trump Foundation, they spent money on a variety of other things that they paid for. They paid a fine to the city of Palm Beach for having a flag that was too big at the Mar-a-Lago mansion. They paid money because there was a hole-in-one tournament at the Trump golf course, and they expected no one would win, and in fact somebody did, and they hadn't bought insurance for it, so they settled by paying money out of the Trump Foundation. So charitable assets only for charitable purposes. Real governance, I've talked about that. Conflict of interest disclosures. People hate conflict of interest disclosures. They hate filling out the forms. They hate providing the information. They're worried about what's going to happen to it. But conflict of interest disclosures are required by law and are a very important part of governance of any organization. And one of the things that your auditor should be asking for is, do you have current conflict of interest disclosures? All right, so when they come around and ask you for that, you have to ask your board members who are not only not getting paid, but are required to contribute on occasion for their conflict of interest disclosures. You have to be able to give them some confidence about how confidential they are, but you need to make sure you get them. And the formal whistleblower policy, especially in 2018, it's been the law since 2014 for non-healthcare facilities, since 2008 for healthcare facilities, that you have to have a whistleblower policy. And here's the reality. 80% of whistleblowers are a pain in the neck and not particularly productive, but you don't know which ones they are. And your people need an opportunity to come inside the organization and say, this is what's happening, I'm concerned about it, and be respected. And that was true when it was about money. But one of the interesting things in this country is if you complain about a financial fraud, you have all these protections, right? You can't lose your job, you can't be reduced in pay. If you complain about sexual harassment, the law is a lot more uncertain, and the protections for whistleblowers, right? If you get fired, that's one thing, but the other protections are much less. So it's very important to make sure your whistleblower policy deals appropriately with the issue of sexual harassment, because my prediction, and my friend Dave Yetemin, who does disaster management for companies, there are 700 senior executives in this country in the last year who have been credibly charged with sexual abuse, and they've had 6 newspaper stories each, at least, on this issue. This is, in terms of thinking about risk and thinking about what's the right thing to do as an organization and what reflects our character, this is the issue for the next few years. And you need to, as a board, to be proactive, and as executive, to be proactive in addressing it. Independent audit committee, again, required by statute, no member is an employee. Thinking about auditor selection. So auditor selection, the audit plan and auditor reporting, the chair of the audit committee, no involvement in audit selection, auditor selection, no involvement in the audit plan with the guys from Florida, and virtually no auditor reporting. Again, that is a whistle or a way for us to know that that organization has significant risks. So I've talked about our cookbook statute, and I think we talk about positive obligations. We want to make sure there's an independent audit committee, and I still see organizations where the CFO is still on the audit committee. Can't do that, right? If you're an employed CEO, you can't be on the audit committee. I've seen organizations where the CEO wants to sit through the entire meeting between the auditor and the audit committee, and the explanation is she or he can explain anything the auditor comes up with, but the whole point, right? If you're on the board, the 3 big most important things you do, right? Hiring the executive director, evaluating the executive director, and firing the executive director. And you need the independence of your auditor to say, here's what we've seen in terms of the organization, and here are concerns we have, or they're doing a great job. Okay, auditors and preparers. The SEC, a number of years ago, there was a great national discussion about whether auditors should be rotated. And the conclusion of the federal government was that they were not prepared to require that. But at the very least, the partners who are on the audit engagement in the nonprofit world should be rotated. Not because they're bad people, but just because when you go back and look at something for the 5th time, you're not as alert about what's going on there, and you're not as focused on what might be a problem, because they didn't find any problems the last time. So talking to your auditor about the audit partner rotation is significant. Loans to officers. We run a project every year from the IRS 990 data to look at for loans to officers, and these are only the ones that are reported. There were, I think, 125 on our first project in New York, which doesn't sound like a lot out of 70,000 charities, except it's illegal in New York to loan money to officers if you're a charity, all right, with certain very minor exceptions. So we pulled that data up. We sent letters to all the organizations. We said, tell us about your 990 shows a loan to officer. Tell us what that loan was for, what the terms were, provide us with the documentation. And by the way, the statute says both directors and the directors are liable for illegally approving a loan. And again, our job is not to make directors miserable, is to say, understand the statute exists, understand what your duties are, let's figure out how you're going to address it going forward. And this is part of my, if you get a letter from the Attorney General, we've been here since 1789 in various versions. We're not going to go away. 1/3 of the people we sent the letters to ignored the letter. Okay, and you say, why would people do that? Well, you ever get a letter from the IRS that you don't want to open? Right? You filed your returns about 8 weeks later, and I don't know about you, but it comes in on a Tuesday. I'm very busy. I put it on the mantelpiece and think I'll look at it over the weekend. All right, and I suspect that people do the same thing, except the weekend turns into a week, turns into a month, and then there's no explosion. Right, so you think maybe it'll just go away, but we will not go away. And it's, again, our focus is not to punish people. Our focus is to say, this is what the law requires. Let's make sure you're in compliance. Talk about whistleblower protection already. Compensation to officers. I find organizations, person's been the president for 20 years, and when he leaves, they say we should give him a bonus of anywhere from $20,000 to $1 million. You have to have a compensation plan. You can't just decide to give away the charitable assets after the service is performed. And so that issue of making sure you have documentation of your compensation plan and your process is significant. Talked about protecting reputations. So people, you'd be amazed, the single biggest hits on the Attorney General websites is the Charities Bureau. People look them up all the time. Now, part of that is every summer when the New York Post has its interns, they send them off to, if they have nothing else for them to do, they'd send them off to look at our registry to see what they can find about people who've been in the news for various things. So that's part of it. And part of it is people just looking up their own documentation, which is good. But people use this information. They use this information for good. They use it to evaluate people to give grants to. They use it to determine whether they want to go to work for you or not. So making sure your information is there is very helpful to you as well as to us. Guidance documents. We have issued, and you'll see this later, we've issued in the last 3 months, we've issued a number of significant guidance documents. The first one is audits, and we revised that after 3 years because their audit requirements are very specific, but we now have the McInerney-Brady experience and a lot of learning about how audit processes work, and we wanted to make that helpful, and we've seen what happened at NILAG with their audit committee. So that's there. Conflict of interest guidance, again, came out in the last month, and I think very useful. Religious corporation transactions just came out. In addition to that, we're going to have a donor advised fund webinar in November and a registration webinar in November. And the idea is to make sure that people want to obtain this information, there's an easy place to get it. We also issue a fundraiser report, and we also try to make sure that if people are competing with you in the charitable space, that they're playing by the same rules. So one of the things we see on a regular basis, what I call Fake-A-Wish foundations. So Make-A-Wish Foundation has been around for 40 years, does a very good job, I think. But it's so successful that people are now doing duplicates. So there's one group from Costa Rica that makes the phone calls and has you send the money in. And very difficult for us to get, there's no extradition treaty. But in terms of protecting the work that charities do, we need to make sure that legitimate charities have that advantage. Holding professionals accountable. We've talked about attorneys and independent auditors, fundraisers and fundraising counsel, And we do that by requiring the fundraisers register, but we also do that by asking you to take a close look at your fundraising contract, what it requires, what you give away. So you should not be giving away your donor list to a fundraiser, right? You should make sure that after they're done doing the fundraising, they give it back to you, and they're not allowed to use it unless you authorize it. My dad used to be in direct mail for Johnson & Johnson, and they would seed the list with a couple of names that they knew that worked for the company or were close to the company, to see if the list person was using the list for something else. Not a bad thought. I've talked about independent auditors already. This is a huge, huge issue. And I talk to charities and say, we're taking money from our charitable mission to spend it on auditors. Why does that make sense? And the answer, when I was in the state government and I first started, and I said, I want auditors, investigators, attorneys, and data people. And the person I was working with said, no commissioner wants to spend money on administration, but if you don't spend money on administration, you're not going to get done the work that you need to get done. And I think, having looked, by the way, I've looked at some Marks Paneth reports, and I'm grateful they don't audit me, just because they're very good and very detailed. But you need to have an auditor that you can count on, not just because it's a requirement, but because a good auditor is going to give you advice about how you're running your business from seeing a lot of people doing the same kind of work. And their opinion on financial statements, again, one of the things we're doing, audit reports, especially if there are exceptions or notes, the language tends to be similar. So one of the things I wanted to do for next year is to be able to search the reports and see what happens, and also to see when auditors leave in the middle of an engagement. Work papers, good auditors do very thorough, very careful work papers, which are very helpful in saying here are the issues. Two other things you should know about, and again, this is a lawyer talking about audit standards, but one of their obligations is if they find illegal acts that come to their attention, they have an obligation to tell the board, right? And that's an important part of their control process. And the management letters, and I've talked about those already. If you get a management letter from your accountant, from your auditor, you want to make sure that the board is paying attention to it, because they don't do it lightly, and it's really important to make sure that what exists is fixed. If you have a risk management process in your organization, that should be one of the major things you focus on. Planning for board members. One of the challenges we look at nonprofits in New York, there are people who say, we can't live without these 5 board members. And so we want to keep them on, and they've been there for 30 years. Rotation is really important. California just passed a law for private sector for-profit corporations saying that you have to have female representation on the board. I think that's going to happen in other places too. But forget the statutes. Let's talk about, if you're the people you serve, you need to make sure that your board reflects the diversity of the people you serve and the commitments you make. Training. I've been to a number of board retreats. I think it gets people to focus early on in their careers on what they're responsible for and how they can do it. And evaluation of board members. And I've been a board member. If you know there's an evaluation, no matter how committed you are, you need to think about what it is after 2 years you've accomplished, and it's a very good way to do that. Risk assessment, I've talked about Me Too. Corporate partnerships are another issue as more and more businesses get into the business of partnering with charities. You don't want to get, well, there's some organizations you don't want to work with, I'll leave it at that. Board members. So one of the issues is if you have a Me Too issue with the senior executive, how does the board get advice, right? Do they go to the in-house general counsel? Do they go to your outside counsel? So you want to make sure that there's a way for the board to access expertise, whether it's forensic accounting expertise or legal expertise, and that they know that they have that ability. Accurate meetings and minutes of meetings and votes. Again, talk about the treasurer. The secretary is a very important part of the board as well, and it's not a job people are running to get, but it's extremely important. If you ever sat through you go to a board meeting and they go through the minutes of the prior meeting and you say, I've been to 1,000 meetings like this. You want to make sure, not necessarily that you're reading every detail of the minute, but the secretary is taking it seriously. Knowledgeable and effective audit committee and whistleblower issues. You want to make sure somebody has the job of following up. Somebody has the job of overseeing the whistleblower process and following up on the complaints. Next thing, board members. So we ask these people to volunteer. We ask them to show up on a regular basis, sometimes to spend their own money, sometimes to contribute their own money. What are we doing for them? All right, and this is a big issue because it's getting harder to get people to serve on boards. That's just the reality. So if you don't have D&O insurance, you should get it. And again, you'll say, this is not money I'm not spending on the mission, but good D&O insurance is not that expensive. And it's only fair to your board members who are volunteers to make sure that they have it. And they cover both losses and defense costs. The second thing is in your bylaws, liability limits and indemnification provisions. And again, you'll need an attorney for this, but the key is your board members should not be exposed personally for negligence claims. That's that in my view. And there are ways to protect them and make sure that that doesn't happen. And what we're finding in the Me Too world is more and more that's suing the directors or officers personally as part of what happens in these cases. And careful attention to our statutory requirements for indemnification. Again, see, if your auditor looked at the financial piece, you want to have a lawyer, depending on the size of your organization, take a look at these issues and give your directors some comfort that these things for their benefit have been undertaken. So with that, I've got, this is the resources I've talked about: our internal controls guidance, conflict of interest guidance. We have our whistleblower policies guidance, sale of nursing homes guidance coming out in the next 2 weeks. We have a New York Prudent Management Institutional Funds webinar that's on our website. Donor Advised Fund thing will be out in November. The other thing is you can get on our influentials list if you want to get the stuff sent to you, if you give me your business cards or pass them on to us. We send things out. Each of these things that's new, we send it out to our influentials list, which now has about 3,000 people in New York State. I hope you can tell I really love this job. I've really had a great time in New York State. The people who work in the nonprofit sector are the most painfully earnest and good people that I've encountered in my 30+ years in government. And, I'd like to be here next year. Don't know the answer to that. But I wish you all good luck and thank you for what you do. Thank you. Do we have time for questions, or what's the process for that? Okay. Okay. Well. Okay. Mike, there was a question.
Thank you very much. I have a question regarding dissolution of non-for-profits.
Right.
Dissolution of non-for-profits. We have some non-for-profit that are very small, insignificant assets,
right,
that they have to go through a rigorous dissolution process. Is there anything being done in order to streamline the process, especially for those non-for-profit that are very, very small, insignificant assets that need to just have a very streamlined process of dissolution?
Okay, this is a great question, and one of the challenges we have is that a significant number of our charities, that they stop doing business, they just disappear off the radar. And so we do have a voluntary dissolution process. And in the last month, we've assigned a paralegal to make sure we gather all the dissolution petitions that have been filed, figure out how we can move more quickly on the low and no asset dissolution. So I don't have an answer for you yet, but we're definitely focusing on the issue. And again, in early next year, I'd like to have an answer that's helpful. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you very much for your attention and good luck.